Before we talk about the text that can shift the dynamic with an avoidant, we need to address the mistake that keeps so many people trapped in frustration, confusion, and heartbreak. Because when an avoidant starts pulling away, most people instinctively respond in a way that feels logical, but actually produces the opposite result. Think about what usually happens. Someone becomes distant. Their messages become shorter. They take longer to reply. They seem emotionally unavailable. Naturally, anxiety kicks in. You start wondering what changed. You want clarity. You want reassurance. You want to restore the connection that once felt effortless. So you reach out more. You send another text. You ask if everything is okay. You try to explain your feelings. You attempt to fix what appears to be breaking. From your perspective, you're fighting for the relationship. From the avoidance perspective, however, something very different is happening. An avoidant is not primarily motivated by connection when they feel overwhelmed. They are motivated by relief. Their nervous system often interprets emotional pressure, even when it comes from love, as a threat to their autonomy. The closer they feel someone moving toward them during a moment of withdrawal, the stronger their instinct becomes to create distance. This is why chasing rarely works. The more urgently you move toward someone who is pulling away, the more you confirm their belief that closeness equals pressure, and the more pressure they feel, the more they seek escape. What's fascinating is that most people misinterpret this reaction. They assume the avoidant needs more convincing, more explanations, more demonstrations of love, but attraction and emotional connection do not grow through persuasion. Human beings rarely feel their deepest emotions because someone argued them into existence. Feelings emerge when there is space to experience them, and this is where many people become trapped in what psychologists often call the Stewart-Distancer dynamic. One person feels distance and moves closer. The other feels that closeness and moves farther away. The first person responds by pursuing even harder. The second person retreats even more. Neither person is intentionally trying to hurt the other. Both are simply responding to discomfort. One fears abandonment, the other fears engulfment. And because each person's solution intensifies the other person's fear, the cycle becomes self-perpetuating. What makes this dynamic so painful is that it often disguises itself as effort. The pursuer feels proactive. They feel committed. They feel like they are doing something productive to save the connection. But effort is not always effective. In fact, some of the most destructive relationship behaviors come from good intentions. You can genuinely care about someone and still respond in a way that pushes them away. You can genuinely love someone and still create conditions that make intimacy harder for them to sustain. This requires a difficult realization. The urge to chase is often less about love and more about fear. Fear of losing the person, fear of uncertainty, fear of not being enough, fear of being forgotten. And fear has a way of disguising itself as urgency. It tells you that if you don't act right now, you'll lose everything. Confidence operates differently. Confidence understands that not every problem requires immediate intervention. Confidence understands that people need room to process their emotions. Confidence understands that someone's out of withdrawal is not always an invitation to pursue harder. Sometimes it is an invitation to stop chasing. Not as a strategy, not as a game, not as manipulation, but as an act of emotional wisdom. Because when you stop running after someone who is creating distance, something important happens. You step out of the role of pursuer. You stop reinforcing the cycle. You stop making your emotional stability dependent on their next message, their next decision, or their next moment of attention. And perhaps most importantly, you give the other person the opportunity to experience something they cannot feel while you're constantly pursuing them, the freedom to move toward you on their own. That freedom matters, because genuine desire cannot be forced. Interest cannot be negotiated. Connection cannot be chased into existence. The paradox is that the harder you try to hold on to someone, the less room you leave for them to choose you. And people value most what they feel free to choose. So before sending another message, before trying to convince, explain, or prove your worth, ask yourself a simple question. Am I acting from confidence, or am I acting from fear? Because the moment you stop chasing is often the moment you finally discover who was willing to meet you halfway. And that knowledge is far more powerful than any pursuit could ever be. Before we go any further, it's important to understand something that surprises many people. The text that changes the dynamic with an avoidant is almost never the text people feel most tempted to send. When emotions are running high, we naturally want certainty. We want answers. We want to know where we stand. That emotional urgency often inspires messages that sound like, "Why are you pulling away? Do you still care about me? Can we talk about what's happening?" These questions are understandable. They come from a very human desire for connection and reassurance. The problem is that an avoidant rarely experiences those messages the way you intend them. What you mean as an invitation to connect can feel, to them, like a demand for emotional processing they are not ready to do. What you see as honesty may be experienced by them as pressure, and pressure, as we've already discussed, is often the very thing that activates their instinct to retreat. This is where the psychology becomes fascinating. Most people assume that communication is primarily about the words being exchanged, but communication is equally about the emotional energy underneath those words. Two people can send almost identical messages, yet create completely different reactions, depending on the emotional state from which those messages are sent. One message says, "Please respond because I need reassurance." The other says, "I'm reaching out because I value the connection, but my well-being does not depend on your response." The words may be similar, the energy is completely different, and human beings are remarkably sensitive to emotional subtext. The most effective text is not the one that demands clarity. It is not the one that attempts to create guilt. It is not the one designed to make someone jealous or afraid. Those approaches might generate a reaction, but a reaction is not the same thing as genuine attraction. A reaction is momentary. Attraction is voluntary. The text that shifts the dynamic is rooted in self-respect. It communicates openness without neediness, warmth without pressure, interest without attachment to a specific outcome. Why does this matter? Because avoidants often live with an internal conflict. Part of them wants connection. Another part fears the vulnerability that connection requires. When someone approaches them with emotional intensity, that fearful side tends to take control. But when someone approaches with calm confidence, they create emotional safety. Safety is a concept that is frequently misunderstood in relationships. People think safety means making someone comfortable all the time. It doesn't. Safety means creating an environment where someone doesn't feel psychologically cornered. It means allowing them the freedom to engage rather than forcing them to defend themselves. A confident text does exactly that. It says, in essence, "I appreciate what we share. I am open to connection, but I am not here to chase, convince, or pressure you." Notice how different that feels. There is dignity in it. There is emotional maturity in it. And perhaps most importantly, there is an absence of hidden agendas. Many people send messages hoping to extract reassurance. They may not realize it consciously, but the message carries a silent request. Please make me feel secure. The challenge is that true security cannot be outsourced. No text message can permanently eliminate insecurity. No response can create lasting self-worth. Those things must come from within. And when they do, your communication changes naturally. You stop trying to use words to control outcomes. You start using words to express truth. That shift is incredibly powerful because people are drawn toward authenticity. They can sense when someone is speaking from grounded confidence rather than emotional desperation. This is why the most impactful text is often surprisingly simple. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't attempt to force a conversation. It doesn't carry the weight of unresolved fears. Instead, it reflects someone who knows their value, regardless of how another person responds. Ironically, that is often what makes an avoidant pay attention. Not because you've played a clever psychological game, not because you've manipulated their emotions, but because you've stepped out of the dynamic they expected. Instead of pursuing, you're relating. Instead of demanding, you're inviting. Instead of seeking validation, you're expressing self-respect. And when that happens, the entire emotional atmosphere changes. The conversation is no longer about whether they choose you, it's about whether the connection still has room to grow. That distinction matters because one position is rooted in scarcity while the other is rooted in abundance. Scarcity says, I need this person. Abundance says, I appreciate this person, but I do not lose myself in the process. And ultimately, that is the energy behind every truly effective message. Not clever wording, not psychological tricks, not the perfect script. Just confidence, clarity, and self-respect expressed through communication. Because the text that changes everything is never the one that asks someone to recognize your moral value. It is the one that proves you already do. Now, once that text has been sent, or perhaps once you've messages at all, the next challenge begins. And for many people, this is actually the hardest part. Because what comes next requires something that feels deeply uncomfortable in a world that constantly encourages immediate action. It requires space. Most people misunderstand space. They treat it as a tactic, a waiting game, a calculated move designed to make someone miss them. But when space is used as a strategy to secretly control another person's behavior, it carries the same emotional dependency as chasing. You're still focused entirely on their reaction. You're still measuring your worth by whether they come back. Real space is different. Real space is not about making someone feel your absence. It's about allowing both people to experience reality without interference. And this is where the psychology of avoidant attachment becomes particularly important. Avoidant individuals often suppress emotional experiences while they are actively immersed in a relationship dynamic. The closer someone gets, the more their attention shifts toward maintaining independence, managing discomfort, or protecting themselves from vulnerability. Their energy becomes focused on the perceived pressure of the relationship rather than the value of the connection itself. Think about it this way. When someone feels trapped, they don't spend much time appreciating the room they're in. Their attention becomes consumed by finding the exit. This is often what happens emotionally with an avoidant. When they feel overwhelmed by expectations, demands, or emotional intensity, they become preoccupied with creating distance. And as long as that pressure remains present, they rarely have the psychological space necessary to process what the relationship actually means to them. This is why constant contact can sometimes produce the opposite of its intended effect. The more reminders they receive, the less opportunity they have to genuinely reflect. The more emotional noise exists, the harder it becomes for them to hear their own feelings. Space changes that. Space removes the immediate pressure. Space interrupts the cycle. Space creates conditions where reflection becomes possible. And reflection is powerful because human beings often understand the value of something most clearly when they are no longer actively resisting it. When the pursuit stops, something interesting happens. The avoidant is no longer responding to your efforts. They're left alone with their own thoughts. Your messages aren't arriving. Your reassurance isn't available. Your attention is no longer filling every silence. For the first time, they have to confront the relationship without the distraction of managing your reactions. And this is often when awareness begins. Not always, not in every situation, but often, because emotions that were buried beneath defensiveness can finally surface. Appreciation can emerge. Curiosity can emerge. Even longing can emerge. Not because you manipulated them into feeling those things, but because there is finally enough psychological room for those feelings to exist. This is one of the great paradoxes of human connection. People need closeness to build intimacy. They also need freedom to recognize what intimacy means to them. Without freedom, connection can feel like obligation. With freedom, connection becomes a choice. And choice is where authentic attraction lives. Many people become impatient at this stage because uncertainty feels unbearable. They want immediate answers. They want guarantees. They want to know whether the avoidant is thinking about them, missing them, or planning to return. But uncertainty is part of the process. In fact, uncertainty often reveals something important, not about the avoidant, but about ourselves. Can we remain emotionally grounded when outcomes are unknown? Can we continue building our lives while waiting for clarity? Can we resist the temptation to interrupt the process simply to relieve our own anxiety? These are difficult questions because they challenge us to develop emotional resilience. And emotional resilience is what transforms space from passive waiting into active growth. Instead of obsessing over what the other person is doing, you begin investing in your own life. You reconnect with friendships. You pursue meaningful goals. You strengthen your sense of identity outside the relationship. You remember that your life is not supposed to pause while someone else decides what they want. Ironically, this is often the point where attraction becomes strongest. Not because you've become unavailable, not because you've mastered some dating strategy, but because you've become fully engaged with your own existence. There is something inherently attractive about a person who is no longer negotiating their value. A person who can love deeply without abandoning themselves. A person who can care without clinging. A person who can accept uncertainty without allowing it to consume them. That energy is powerful because it reflects emotional freedom. And emotional freedom has a way of inspiring movement in others. Whether the avoidant returns or not, you win something far more valuable in the process. Your center of gravity shifts back to where it belongs, back to your values, back to your purpose, back to your self-respect. Because ultimately, space is not about creating distance between two people. It's about creating enough room for truth to reveal itself. And the truth that survives space is always stronger than the connection that depends on constant pursuit. And this brings us to the most important part of the entire conversation. Because after understanding why chasing pushes an avoidant away, after learning how to communicate with confidence instead of pressure, and after recognizing the value of giving space, there is still one question that remains. What is it that actually makes an avoidant want to move toward you? Most people assume the answer lies in finding the perfect text, saying the perfect thing, or using the perfect strategy. They believe there is some hidden formula that will unlock another person's chaos emotions and guarantee a desired outcome. But the deeper truth is far more powerful than that. The thing that creates the strongest attraction is not a technique, it is a mindset. And that mindset begins when you stop making someone else's, attention, the center of your emotional world. This is where many people struggle, because when we care deeply about someone, it is easy to confuse love with attachment. We begin measuring our happiness by their responses. We monitor their level of interest. We wait for signs that they still care. Gradually, without realizing it, we hand over authority for our emotional well-being to another person. The problem is that no relationship can thrive when one person's sense of value depends entirely on the other person's approval. That creates pressure. And pressure, as we've discussed throughout this conversation, is exactly what tends to overwhelm avoidant individuals. What draws people toward us is not our need for them, it is our ability to remain whole in their absence. Think about the people who leave the strongest impression on you. Rarely are they the people desperately trying to earn acceptance. More often, they are the people who possess a quiet sense of self-respect. They enjoy connection, but they are not defined by it. They appreciate others, but they do not abandon themselves in the process. That quality creates emotional gravity, not because it is mysterious, not because it is manipulative, but because it signals something incredibly attractive: emotional security. Avoidants, despite their fears around intimacy, are still human beings. They are still drawn to confidence. They still notice authenticity. They still feel the pull of someone who has a meaningful life, clear values, and a strong sense of identity. In fact, many avoidants spend much of their lives trying to protect their independence. So when they encounter someone who is equally independent, someone who is capable of loving without clinging, it often feels refreshing. There is no burden in that dynamic, no emotional chasing, no constant demands for reassurance, just two people choosing each other freely. And that word matters, choosing, because healthy attraction is built on choice, not dependency. The moment you shift from, "I need this person to choose me," to, "I am deciding whether this relationship is right for me," everything changes. Your energy changes. Your standards change. Your confidence changes. You stop viewing yourself as someone waiting to be accepted. You start viewing yourself as someone evaluating compatibility. That is a profound psychological shift. Suddenly, every interaction looks different. Instead of wondering, "How do I make them come back?" you begin asking, "If they come back, have they shown the capacity to build the kind of relationship I deserve?" Instead of obsessing over whether they value you, you begin considering whether they are demonstrating values that align with yours. This is the point where personal power returns. And personal power is incredibly attractive because it communicates abundance. An abundant mindset does not mean arrogance. It does not mean pretending not to care. It simply means understanding that your future does not depend on one person's decision. You can want someone without needing them. You can miss someone without losing yourself. You can hope for reconciliation without putting your entire life on hold. That emotional balance is rare. And because it is rare, it stands out. Ironically, this is often when avoidants begin to feel drawn back toward the connection. Not because you have convinced them, not because you have pressured them, but because the dynamic has fundamentally changed. You are no longer standing in the same place, waiting for validation. You are moving forward. You are growing. You are building a life that feels meaningful, regardless of what they choose. And there is something undeniably compelling about a person who is fully engaged with their own life. Someone who has purpose, someone who has passion, someone who has self-respect, someone who understands that love should complement their life, not become their entire identity. Whether an avoidant returns or not, this mindset creates a victory that cannot be taken away from you. Because the real goal was never to make someone chase you. The real goal was to become the kind of person who never has to chase their worth. And when you stop seeking validation from others, you become impossible to ignore, not because you demand attention, but because you finally understand your own value.